Well, good morning and good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the webinar 2023 Innovation Planning, reviewing key developments of 2022 and predictions for the future. My name is Cecilia G. here at Lux Research, and I'll be kicking off today's session. Arif Mbarakel, our Senior Vice President and Group Director, will be moderating Q&A at the end of the session, and I'll also be presenting alongside my colleagues, Nardev Ramanathan, Harini Venkatraman, Ian Reinhardt, and Kristen Marshall. Together, we also lead each of the core industry verticals here at Lux, including oil and gas, utilities, digital, CPG, manufacturing, and chemicals, and help clients like yourself roadmap businesses into the future. Throughout the webinar, you can type any questions you have in the questions box on your screen, and time permitting, we'll answer all the questions that we can. If your question does not get answered, please don't hesitate to email it to questions@luxresearchinc.com, and we'll do our best to respond. So we're in the thick of Q4. It is a fun time of year. We wrapped up quite a large chunk of research and thinking already, and more folks are asking us, how should they think about next year? What trends do you need to keep an eye on, and how can you preempt 2023? So I want to take a review of what's been the most interesting pieces that Lux has put out so far, determined by you and your clicks. Then I'll turn to my colleagues to help us understand what trends surfaced throughout 2022 and how these are actually impacting all of us, not just in our respective industries. And finally, close with some forward-looking thoughts as we move into the next year. So firstly, what has been the highlight of 2022 research? Well, looking at reports by sector. Now, before I begin, it's no coincidence that we've segmented these in order of value chain from more or less upstream to downstream. And so we have reports that answer some very critical questions here. Within oil and gas, we've looked, of course, into the hydrogen economy from end to end, including production, whether that's green, blue, or turquoise, to end application. And one key component is, of course, in storage and transport. So this report, the hydrogen economy, the cost of storage and transport, defines what exactly are our options, and will storage and transport be a bottleneck to scaling up the hydrogen economy? In chemicals, the war on plastic waste has been top of mind for clients for some time already, and this has of course resulted in a flurry of innovation for recycling. But recycling, it's worthless without waste collection and the consolidation of inputs to actually get recycled. So this report, Innovations for the Waste Supply Chain of 2030, looks at what needs to happen to create a circular supply chain and breaks down the innovations occurring in the waste collection and sorting spaces. Now, within industrials, building materials are at the nexus of almost every trend in sustainable innovation. This report, Building in 2030, The Future of Sustainable Building Materials, analyzes commercially viable materials for reducing the carbon footprint of buildings and identifies opportunities for companies in adjacent industries to bring sustainable solutions to the construction industry. Now, within utilities, of course, energy storage technologies are poised for rapid growth. And not surprisingly, they're driven primarily by increased demand for electric vehicles and grid storage. So this report, Energy Storage Market Forecast 2022 edition, helps us understand not only where the market is going, but also what potential challenges could limit the pace of this growth. For CPG, cell-free systems are emerging as a sustainable biomanufacturing pillar to produce a range of specialty chemicals. But despite their potential, there are challenges to scale enzymatic systems. So this report, The Landscape of Cell-Free Biomanufacturing, analyzes the key technology components and business model approaches adopted by cell-free players and highlights the ways to engage in this space. And within digital, of course, globalization has led to significant improvements in efficiency, but it has also forged an increasingly complex supply chain that's susceptible to single points of failure. And so these failures could represent billions of dollars in lost assets and vulnerabilities. So the report, Reinventing the Global Supply Chain, the Role of Warehouse Robotics, actually addresses ongoing concerns for many clients with a global reach with supply chain and logistics concerns. And it spans beyond the warehouse sector, as clients from other industries have also been asking about robotics and automation for manufacturing, for oil and gas, and agri-food. So those are some very specific reports. Now moving on to startup innovation. You can see we have a variety of different startups here that have been the most clicked by you based on our Lux company profiles. And since you can find many of these on the Lux member site itself, instead of going over these one by one, I wanted to highlight some of the key themes that are actually underpinning this selection that we see today. For example, across oil and gas, chemicals, and industrials, quite a big theme that we're seeing here is around the carbon economy, around footprint and emissions abatement. So of course, within oil and gas, you have companies very active within carbon management, emissions reduction, CCU, hydrogen, carbon capture and utilization, that is. Within chemicals, very much similarly, you're seeing a lot of CCU, a lot of CO2 utilization for chemicals and materials. And similarly, within industrial, the popular profiles are, again, quite a lot of interest in CCU for building materials, but then also ammonia production and circular manufacturing for polymer composites. Within utilities, like I've mentioned, quite a lot of the focus is around energy storage. And within CPG, those top red profiles are really aligned with this overall trend for sustainable alternative ingredients, alongside technologies to expedite consumer product development. And the main theme for startups in the digital space is that these are companies that are taking a platform-based approach to addressing enterprise needs across multiple industry sectors, from all that you see here, oil and gas to chemicals to industrials to utilities. Now, beyond just looking at some of these pieces sector by sector, I also wanted to dive deeper into pieces that go beyond any one industry. And so here are some reports or some events that we've held that are taking a step back. And so the first is the top priorities of innovation leaders. This is a presentation in which we did a deep dive into the main questions that might keep you up at night as an innovation leader, and what priorities should actually be at the top of your list as you plan your innovation strategy. The next was this report and webinar called Transforming Open Innovation. And here we took a systematic view of innovation clusters, whether those are incubators or accelerators, to not only identify where the growth opportunities are, on how to work with these groups, but also understand how do you use these as solutions to fix your problems. Now, with our inaugural Lux debate, we looked at this question of, is sustainability the enemy of growth? And it surfaced some very compelling arguments from both sides to understand how to solve this global challenge and responsibility of sustainability and growing your business while doing so. And last piece I wanted to highlight was on blockchain. And this webinar really scrutinized the fine line between hype and reality and asked the question, what are the most impactful real-world use cases of blockchain, going into areas as diverse as carbon trading, plastic waste tracking, logistics, industrial IoT, consumer data, and even the metaverse. Now, moving on, I'm very excited to actually introduce the launch of one of our new products here, our Lux Inspire reports. These pieces provide high-level innovative insights to help think and strategize about new areas for your businesses. For example, the Lux Carbon Credit Portfolio tool. Of course, this Inspire report helped us understand the carbon credit space overall, but even more than that, it presents a framework to understand the risk and affordability associated with different types of credits and how these must align with your company to help you buy time, decrease your footprint, and help limit global warming. Now, with the Lux Net Zero strategy framework and surviving the energy transition, here, of course, the oil and gas industry is facing a complete transformation. And after a century of dominance in which oil and gas had been society's main energy source, of course, the world is now moving on to other primary energy sources. And that puts folks in tough dilemmas with hard decisions to make. And this report outlines what strategies are available for an oil and gas company to move forward and survive the energy transition. With the Lux Sustainable Policy Framework, this is really going to take a look into projected policy actions and mounting industry promises, because those are the things that are setting the stage for very rapid change by 2030. So the report covers how evolving policies and corporate promises can align to enable sustainable transitions for the CPG sector and provide a framework to act on for value chain players. And with the Lux Sustainable Manufacturing Radar, well, across industries, manufacturing has a significant environmental footprint, and its mitigation is critical to fight climate change. However, it could be a struggle to develop a sustainable manufacturing strategy due to uncertainties around technology maturity, impact, and timeline for implementation. So this report helps us understand and weigh the different options in sustainable manufacturing. So that's the highlight reel of 2022 research, which I think is quite an interesting and wide variety of different pieces, and hopefully at least one of those is something that is directly applicable to you. Now, it would be remiss not to talk a bit about some of the key and big events that have shocked our world. So as we get into some of the cross-industry insights first, I'd like to mention, of course, the Paris Agreement and the nationally determined contributions, the NDCs that came out of it that serve as a foundation to many of our industries and our countries' technology policies moving forward. And of course, very tragically, the war in Ukraine sent shockwaves across the world in every single industry, which we continue to feel the ramifications of and will be trying to speculate what this will mean for the future as well. And lastly, another world event, another American-centric event, I would say, is the Inflation Reduction Act in the US, which is the largest investment stimulus in renewable energy and decarbonization of the economy in the US. So we do expect this will trigger some very key investments. Now, since these events all are having global repercussions, we'd also like to point out that my colleagues on the line here today, joining you virtually, and myself are from 3 different continents and time zones to bring in a global perspective to our respective industries. And of those perspectives, I do want to do deeper dives into a few cross-cutting trends. So I won't read all of these trends listed here out loud, since we're going to dive deeply into each one for this next section. And so coming up, we will take turns to discuss this key trend and prediction for 2023 per sector, and also invite our teammates to add as a voice from other industries to really understand how these trends are very much cross-cutting, cross-industry, and impacting all of us in similar and different ways. So I'll kick things off here first with oil and gas. Of course, the Ukraine crisis has had massive effects on the oil and gas industry. And overall, what we're going to see here is a massive shift in gas. The gas crisis is here. We expect it to only become more volatile and unpredictable. And for example, in the past, if you were to take a leaf out of the oil industry's book, in the past, oil prices were incredibly boring and steady until the 1970s crisis. And after that, oil prices had fluctuated all over the place and became quite unreliable. So similarly, we are now seeing the gas crisis. And if you're planning to use gas long-term, you'll have to perhaps think twice, as if companies have the opportunity, they will try to ditch gas in favor of something more reliable and more dependable, perhaps like hydrogen. So of course, there's been a lot of volatility here, but I think that also opens up to the opportunity to try to understand, well, how can policy also affect industries? So Ian here, I know there's perhaps a flurry of policy also impacting your sector. What are your thoughts around here?
Yeah, thanks, Cecilia. Of course, the near-term energy supply crunch is top of mind, but I think the Ukraine conflict, and particularly the way that the US and Europe used sanctions against Russia, has sharpened the sense that the innovative high-tech sector is a core part of national security. Governments are enacting policies to onshore production of critical minerals, semiconductors, quantum computing, etc. As you prepare for next year, adjust your innovation strategy and supply chains to the constraints and opportunities in this new policy environment.
And for the digital side, there are definitely opportunities for digital technologies to help manage and deal with this volatility. two technologies come to mind here. First is AI, and we've looked at how AI is playing a bigger role, particularly in the upstream sector for applications such as well planning for optimized economics, crude logistics, and trading optimization. The second technology is automation and robotics to deal with concerns around workforce shortages. We're starting to see innovation around autonomous mobile robots or AMRs for offshore sites and robotics for subsea inspection, repair, and maintenance. Our warehouse robotics report that Cecilia mentioned earlier, although dealing more on warehousing and logistics side of things, has gained a lot of interest from oil and gas clients as well. So you definitely want to look at AI and automation tools going into 2023. And now I'll hand it back over to Cecilia to walk us through some developments in the utility sector. So over to you, Cecilia.
Yeah, perfect. Thank you so much, Ian and Ardev. Those are super interesting complementary pieces in terms of where we're seeing this industry going. Now, maybe on the other side of the coin, looking at what the utility space and how this will transform in 2023. I think one thing that people have not mentioned enough is actually investment. So if you look at the energy crisis in the EU today, of course, a lack of supply of Russian gas does create an energy crisis, but there's another thing that's also happening, which there's been a lack of investment, and there still is. And so I do think when we project into 2023, expect the utilities sector to double down in energy capacity, but also keep in mind, if you are doing so, that this does potentially create other challenges or bottlenecks in energy storage, and grid capacity, and the sheer amount of land that is needed to do so. I think one caveat here is that as you are implementing renewables like wind energy, like solar, quite often you will actually need to install much more capacity, perhaps up to 2.5 times capacity, at a price that is about 2 times higher in capex compared to, for example, a traditional coal-fired power plant. And so there is going to be a large demand for cash needed to do so in order to scale supply to meet the demand that we're seeing. So I think one part that is really interesting, and Nardev has kind of mentioned this already, is how digital tools can actually be complementary to utilities as well.
Absolutely, Cecilia. The utility sector needs to start thinking out of the box with the shifting energy landscape in terms of increased renewables penetration, decentralization with the rise of VPPs and even bidirectional flows. And digital technologies can definitely play a role there. For example, we're seeing interesting partnerships emerge between, for example, smart thermostat OEMs, distributed energy resource platforms, and grid operators. Recently, for example, Google Nest partnered with Voltus, a DERMS provider, and PJM Interconnection, which is the largest grid operator in the US. And the interesting thing is companies like Google Nest and Voltus have a lot of consumption data around how consumers basically consume energy. And they can even provide monetization incentives to users for energy saving habits, especially during periods of high energy demand. So there's an opportunity here to moderate from the demand side. In fact, we have an Inspire report coming up focusing on data monetization for the utility sector coming out at the end of the year. So definitely watch out for that on how we think about data monetization. And now with that, I actually want to move on and talk about carbon management. So carbon management basically is, if you think about it, it involves accounting, tracking, and it's critical towards net zero goals as well, but it's rife with challenges. We'll be having more research on this for 2023 from a digital angle, but right now what we're seeing is certainly 3 areas of innovation and opportunity. The first is around aerial capabilities. So we see satellite imaging being very important here. A lot of innovation happening there, for example, in terms of hyperspectral imaging, thermal imaging, which are offering deeper insights into carbon emissions, tracking, and monitoring. These technologies can support a wide range of industry sectors from agri-food, CPG, energy utilities, industrials, and manufacturing. The second is more around ground-based digital technologies for tracking. So we're talking about innovation in AI-enabled sensors, infrared imaging, computer vision, and even electronic nose capabilities, which could unlock more accurate real-time sensing for complex scenarios. And last but not least, we have platforms where we're seeing innovation happening there as well. We've heard about carbon trading platforms and even carbon exchanges. But recently we came across a product carbon footprint tracking platform for Scope 3 emissions, which typically accounts for over 80% of carbon footprint. Siemens is that organization that is building a product carbon footprint tracking platform, which aggregates all carbon footprint data from all suppliers on the platform using blockchain technology. So one thing you definitely want to do in 2023 is to partner or invest in digital technologies for carbon management. Cecilia, presumably there's a lot of interest from the energy and utility sector in this area as well.
Yeah, absolutely, Nardev. And you hit the nail on the head. I mean, within the oil and gas sector, of course, transparency and standardization are very, very key for companies to prove that we are indeed reducing our emissions. And so we really see digital tools as a key part of ensuring that those new technologies that promise a lot of emissions reductions, that promise decarbonization, are actually reliable and accurate to their claims. For example, we don't want to be implementing a carbon capture facility that releases more CO2 than it actually captures, or applicably similar to many other technologies that make those kinds of claims. In addition, I would say, as another example, digital tools can also be very key for CBAM, which is the Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism. And this is a policy that is not enacted yet, but will be imposing a levy on goods imported into the EU. And I suspect a lot of the administrative work will begin next year. This is something as well where I think digital tools can absolutely help standardize and make sense of a lot of the policy. Now, I know there's a lot of interest as well into Scope 2 and 3. Ian, I know you must get asked a lot about that aspect as well. What are your thoughts here?
Yeah, thanks, Cecilia. Although it's probably premature to invest much effort in Scope 3 tracking, we do see a lot of client interest in that topic. For industrial companies, tracking Scope 2 and 3 emissions will not be possible without a robust multi-party software solution. And Nardev mentioned one example from Siemens. There are others out there. And that's as true for cars as it is for buildings. As these carbon tracking efforts become more mature, it'll be interesting to see if and how commodity markets begin to stratify based on the supplier's carbon footprint rather than the material grade as we see in a conventional commodity market. Back to you, Nardev.
Perfect. Thanks, Ian. Thanks, Cecilia. And now I'll hand it over to Harini to walk us through what's happening in biomanufacturing. Over to you, Harini.
Thank you so much, Nardev. I know we heard a lot in the upstream. Moving a little bit downstream, one key technology trend that is definitely impacting the entire CPG sector is the momentum around biomanufacturing. And again, when we think about biomanufacturing, it's pretty much like this broad topic, right? It includes many different enabling technologies from fermentation-based methods, but also cell-free enzymatic methods, which can be used for targeting a lot of different ingredients from ag biologicals or food ingredients, or even specialty chemicals. Overall, what you're witnessing now in 2022 and going into 2023 is that we will see an increased support for biomanufacturing from governments. We already have President Biden, for instance, issuing the executive order to strengthen domestic biomanufacturing capabilities. And this will definitely have an impact across many industries, right? Agriculture, chemicals, and oil and gas even. At the same time, what we're also seeing is that the USDA, for example, is also investing about $500 million to think about the future of sustainable fertilizer production. And that would definitely pave the way for more ag biotech momentum. Another topic which we've kind of brought within the broader biomanufacturing pillar is the precision fermentation. We've seen a massive spike in interest to make everything from animal-free dairy products to health ingredients or lipids and all of that. And it really plays at the intersection of sustainability and decarbonization there. When it comes to CPGs, what we're also witnessing is that they are really implementing biotech strategies in their growth plan. And one recent example that we've seen is Unilever's JV with Genomatica Geno to really develop alternative routes for palm oil production or even ingredients that are derived thereof. Sustainable palm oil, that's pretty elusive still. But what's interesting is the step taken by companies like Unilever. They'll create a long-term path to success, and you'll see more players joining. We just saw Cow Corporation join this JV. So it really goes on to show interest from downstream players, but also you'll see more upstream companies joining there. One critical aspect to all of this is going to be that partnership element, right? Because it really requires expertise from different industry players, be it for feedstock optimization or the sustainable bioreactor setups, or even like separation technologies downstream. I think what we'll end up seeing is an involvement of a lot of industry players, but also to find the right partner to bridge the gap in terms of finding the next step for closing the loop there, I would say. And I think that's a good segue probably to hear from Kristen and Cecilia about the initiatives in chemical and energy sector, especially around biomanufacturing and how that may potentially play into the broader decarbonization strategy.
Yeah, absolutely. Harini, in the chemical space for the longest time, when we've spoken with clients, we've spoken with them about targeting these low volume, high margin applications when it comes to fermentation. But just this year, in the past couple of years, we've seen players like Geno showing us that you can have success in these higher volume markets. And it's because how they strategized which molecules to target. So, the most successful developers we're seeing in the space are really prioritizing areas where there are these strong external factors like decarbonization, interest in decarbonization for alternatives. So, in the case of Cargill and Helms, their new joint venture where they're investing a couple $100 million into bringing online a 1,4-butane-diol plant, that butane-diol is going to be used for bio-based spandex. And if you look at where there's interest, there's a lot of interest there from these brands, these athleisure brands in decarbonization, but they're also willing to pay more of a premium for their using biospandex and other types of renewable materials in their products. But I will say what's interesting moving forward is to see if new opportunities really do open up from this growing government support, like Biden's executive order. And, I think now is the time that it's really important to pay attention to what's happening with policy, because it could be tipping the scale in favor of some of these more alternative routes, which, in the past we've seen kind of slug along, I would say. But Cecilia, I know that I've seen, a lot of news and excitement around LanzaTech this year. So I'm curious to hear kind of your perspective and what you're seeing in the oil and gas space.
Yeah, absolutely. I think if you were to have asked us years ago, some of the biomanufacturing options, whether it's a microbial conversion, whether it's something like methanogenic archaea, like our Electrochaea does, it could have been met with a lot more scrutiny because these are quite delicate living organisms that we're working with. However, now we're seeing so much commercial traction, especially with a company like LanzaTech, which is huge and commercial with many, many partnerships, gone public through SPAC. They've really made, I would say, a landmark a moment for this type of technology, for biomanufacturing, to say, hey, we've developed an alternative route that is showing very, very strong emissions reductions potential, and perhaps unlike other CO2 utilization pathways, do not have, let's say, some of the same needs as an electrochemical cell might need. So definitely, I think a lot of interest in looking at biomanufacturing, whether it's microbial conversion, whether it's use of some other microorganism, to be able to say, hey, we can reduce your emissions, we can help decarbonize these sectors that are very, very difficult to decarbonize.
Yeah, very
I think definitely overall.
Now, I was just thinking about both the adjacent industries and your perspective. I think definitely fascinating to see the development and the implementation of biomanufacturing going into 2023. I'm going to turn it over to Ian to hear some exciting trends around waste valorization that he's been seeing.
Yeah, thank you, Harini. Companies in many industries are looking for ways to reduce hazardous waste and partnerships to valorize useful wastes. Using one company's waste as a feedstock is a form of industrial symbiosis and a core element of circular manufacturing. My colleague Akshay Chowdhury has written a great short piece on industrial symbiosis, which is a broader concept including energy transfers, for example, using waste heat from another company's process. And on the material side, under the current carbon accounting principles, waste material doesn't come with the emissions attached. So byproduct like steel slag can be a low carbon input, even though it's coming from steel manufacturing. Lux Research often assists clients with questions like, what can I do with my waste chemical ABC? Or we can use material XYZ as our feedstock. What companies produce it as a byproduct? Some examples we have seen in the industrial sector are carbonating reactive mineral waste with CO2 emissions to produce low carbon cement substitute, converting unrecyclable plastic waste into aggregate that becomes filler, or producing interior building products like tiles, insulation, wall panels, and so on with agricultural waste. Yeah, I'd like to ask now Kristen and Harini to tell us how you're seeing companies approach this topic in your industries. Harini?
Yeah, absolutely. I think agri-food waste streams, as you rightly mentioned, they have a wealth of raw materials. In fact, waste valorization is one of those key topics or hot topics, you could say. We get asked a lot from both ingredient, but also CPG clients. And I really like the concept of industrial symbiosis we often talk about, right? From the CPG side, one interesting development that we've seen is a partnership with a German brewery, Bitburger. They actually partnered with a company called Mush Labs, which is a mycoprotein startup. And the goal here is really to use and upcycle the spent grains into an edible mycelium protein, really leading to the circular process. I'd say overall there are a lot of opportunities for CPGs, especially when they want to think about waste valorization. But the traditional challenge has been commercializing and monetizing these circular opportunities, because you have a multiple number of parameters to take into account, be it the resource availability or what type of business model would you use, or even the regulations, right? I think it plays a very key role there. We are currently working on a report to provide our clients with this framework to identify opportunities across the value chain for waste valorization. So I'd say going into 2023, this will definitely be a key area for CPG players to focus on.
Yeah, and just kind of just kind of adding to what Harini said, because I, have been seeing, I've heard a lot of interest in, CPG players and even waste management players, right? Thinking about entering into even material spaces, right? Because of the opportunities that some technologies, like maybe producing PHAs, for example, or polyhydroxyalkanoates from waste streams presents them. But I would say that, it's really important, from my experience and the clients that I've engaged with, to really think about each of those opportunities individually, and not just pursue them because you have a waste stream and because that waste stream could be converted into that thing. It's really important that you take a step back and really kind of compare what the different opportunities are, as well as thinking about what your own core capabilities are. And what the needs are for the industries that you might be trying to penetrate into. So that's just some words of caution when it comes to waste valorization, because not all opportunity is a good opportunity. But just more broadly, I think when it comes to circularity, there's been a lot of talk around waste conversion technologies. But, and maybe this is moving into, my own topic on traceability, there's not been enough talk about how to adequately collect and sort out different waste streams, or be able to rapidly characterize the type and volume of waste you have. And I would still say that these are still pretty big unmet needs that are getting, we're getting asked more and more about. And it's one of the reasons why we put together our Plastic Waste Management 2030 report this past year. So it may sound obvious, but if we really do want to transition more towards a circular economy, we're going to have to really focus on establishing these circular supply chains. And this is where traceability can and will play a big part. So this involves establishing a better understanding of material flows throughout their life cycle. And, really, if implemented correctly, it can help to assign a value to waste for consumers and encourage opportunities for end of life, like letting a consumer know about proper disposal. And I would say that, recognizing the importance of traceability for the circular economy, we've even seen policy starting to merge, like in the European Union. There are new rules emerging around products needing to have digital product passports. And so this would be, essentially where, products would have to have these passports so that consumers could easily retrieve information on the material composition, or they could have information or instructions on how to repair or properly dispose of the product. And even moving into the chemical sector, we're seeing interest in things like digital product passports. Just 2 weeks ago, LyondellBasell, they announced that they were going to develop a prototype with Circularize of a digital product passport for their products with partners along their value chain. That being said, and we are seeing, in order for these circular supply chains to be implemented, we're going to have collaboration right across value chain, and especially with consumer products developers. And so I'm actually curious, Harini, what are your thoughts and what have you been hearing around traceability in CPG?
Yeah, no, 2022, we saw a lot of traceability related efforts coming from CPG players. But I have to say that a bit of that has been driven by the blockchain hype, I would say. For instance, we just saw Unilever partner with SAP for palm oil traceability. We also witnessed BASF announcing a collaboration with another company to really get the farm to fork data for palm kernel oil. Now, beyond all of these commodities, I think what's also interesting to see is that there is an overall interest to implement a traceability solution, be it blockchain based or non-blockchain based. And I know we'll hear a bit from Nardev, definitely his point of view from digital, but I would say overall what's important for CPGs to keep in mind is that there's a lot of value in traceability, but also start thinking about it beyond just supply chain optimization to really target more directed impact on sustainability. And to that, I guess, ensuring provenance and accurate data collection, I think that's going to be a very key piece and absolutely essential there. And Nardev, if you want to just add on a bit about like your perspective and what you see around blockchain-based initiatives, that would be great.
Absolutely, Harini. I think you already touched on bits and pieces on the blockchain. I'm just going to add on some views from the digital side as well. So blockchain, definitely provides a good way forward in terms of tackling issues of trust and transparency. However, it does not in and of itself solve tracking and traceability issues. For example, if the data that's going into the blockchain is compromised or is inaccurate, there's nothing really that you can do about it. The data will continue lingering and being on the blockchain, and the operation itself is irreversible, right? The very nature of blockchain. Blockchain implementation is also challenging, requiring buy-in from all stakeholders to participate. In fact, several high-profile projects from BASF, Aramco, Bayer, and Alibaba are still yet to gain traction. So yeah, building off your point, Harini and Christine, blockchain can help, but you need to understand its strengths and limitations moving forward into 2023.
Yeah, absolutely, Nardev. And I think, with these pilots projects, from especially the ones that you mentioned, I think we're going to be able to, they're going to be able to uncover, right, some of those challenges with implementation. And considerations like, what if the underlying asset is compromised, right, and yet the information does not match reality. But that being said, I think it's still important to think about these different opportunities in traceability moving forward, and even beyond sustainability, right? Having that data on material and product flows can also help in terms of like alleviating risk and helping companies to respond faster to things like supply chain disruption. And with that, I think I'm going to pass it back to Cecilia to kind of wrap things up and, move things on into predictions for 2023.
Perfect. Yeah. And so we just spent this time looking at cross-industry trends and impacts, whether that was within oil and gas, utilities, chemicals, industrial, CPG, and digital. So what I wanted to do to wrap things up, instead of a typical, here is an outlook, 1, 2, 3 key takeaways, I actually wanted to call back some of the content that we had, and so that if you were to attend this same webinar next year, what would we say are companies to be monitoring and to keep an eye on as you move into 2023. So similarly, some of the themes here, I think for oil and gas are absolutely still are and will be very relevant. So within oil and gas, an underpinning theme again is around carbon management and emissions reduction. So what are those core technologies that can really get you radical decrease in CO2 emissions? Of course, here's the theme that really sticks out is carbon capture, carbon utilization, and as well as hydrogen production. So kicking this off over to Kristen, what are you seeing for chemicals?
Yeah, thanks, Cecilia. I think what the types of companies that I'm excited to monitor in 2023 would be companies that are helping to scale up fermentation processes, right? You know, we've heard about service providers in the past, you know, focus more on strain development, but I'm really interested, I think, in 2023 to keep track of companies like 21st Bio that are looking to support the other piece, which would be scale up. I'm also interested in continuing to monitor CO2 utilization companies, so fermentation of you know, these carbon gas streams. But you know, company that I'm interested in, still very early stage, is iMicrobes, but they have developed an omnitroph that can, you know, they claim can take on dirtier mixed carbon gas streams, which you know, is really interesting. And then, you know, lastly, I mentioned, or I talked a bit about traceability, enabling circularity, and so keeping to monitor companies like Circularize, as well as companies like Polysecure that have either digital or physical methods for tracking material flows. And so those are the types of companies that, you know, we'll continue to monitor in 2023, but I'm, you know, particularly excited about. And I'll pass it along to Ian to talk about some of the exciting companies, industrials.
Thanks. Yeah, we expect that CCU and the hydrogen economy will remain hot topics. Carbon Clean is already deploying its solution at cement plants and steel plants. Ionomer makes an advanced membrane for electrolysis. The third company here, Electra, they're decarbonizing steel production. And Metalens, which makes optical metamaterials. These are both innovation leaders in dynamic industries. On to Cecilia for utilities.
Yeah, thanks, Ian. So I think when we look at utilities, the main key themes here are really looking at what are we going to do about storage, what about grid flexibility, and also rapid expansion of renewables. So Harini for CPG.
I think for the CPG sector, the policies and regulations will underpin several key developments. Companies like Pivot Bio here, they really are developing biofertilizers. They would be attracting significant interest, but also sustainable oils or sustainable ingredient sourcing from companies like No Palm will drive a bit further of value chain innovation. And last but not the least, I think we're going to see some interesting developments on the regulatory landscape for cell-based meat. So companies like Wild Type would probably evoke quite some interest in 2023.
And for digital, in 2022, we actually saw the top 3 companies being more of platform companies. But what we are predicting to see is that the startups that we will want to monitor, and we're already seeing these startups getting a lot of interest already, is more related to carbon management and sustainability. And they're really innovating more on the imaging technologies and the sensors. So Carbon Space is a satellite and carbon dioxide flux station, data-centric agriculture carbon footprint monitoring platform, where a lot of what they do is actually trying to understand sort of carbon dioxide flux. Satellite VU basically innovates on high-resolution thermal imaging solutions to solve sustainability problems, identify heat signatures, and basically empower various industries looking to understand this better. And last but not least, we have Planet. which is basically innovating on high-resolution Earth imagery using nano satellites. So, you definitely want to, look at, companies innovating in this space, and definitely watch out for these startups as well. And with that, I'll turn it back over to Cecilia to round us off. So back to you, Cecilia.
Fantastic. So thank you everyone for some of these predictions for next year and some of the key shifts in all of our industries. We will now be taking questions that any of you might have on the presentation, which we just shared, and in which the Q&A will be moderated by Ashley from Verical. So you can type any questions into the questions box, and if we do not get to your questions on this call, someone from Lux will be in touch after the webinar. So for now, on behalf of myself, Harini, Kristen, Ian, and Nardev, thank you very, very much for your time. Back over to you, Rowdy.
Thank you, Cecilia. So, hello everyone. I'm really honored to be moderating the Q&A session of this webinar. If you're anything like me, you're probably extremely dizzy now by all of the exciting and also somewhat daunting developments that we can see happening next year. We've talked about a lot of things, and let me start by I don't know how to do this over a webinar, but let's have a round of applause for our research leaders here who are across all of the time zones and across the entire value chain, from oil and gas all the way down to CPG and everything in between, looking at innovations and pointing out the critical things that you should be aware of next year, which are a lot of things. So let's get down to some of the questions. One question is maybe directed towards Nardev, but it might be that Kristen and Ian have something to say about it as well. It's about tracing and traceability. So Nardev, and you mentioned this already in your outlook, where you pointed out that there's a shift as far as you're concerned from focus on platforms to focus on traceability and measurements. And we see that most prominently, I think, in the area of sustainability, right? Where companies need to substantiate their claims of being carbon neutral or reducing carbon footprints or becoming sustainable or what have you by showing some sort of data behind it. And most often the data is also a model. So can you comment a little bit on that? What's going to happen next year and what kind of developments should our clients be aware of in the area of traceability? And also, how do you prevent that from being just greenwashing? How do you make it real, as in referring to some physical reality in the end?
Absolutely. Thank you very much, Ari, for that question. And, I think, talking about tracking, traceability, and talking about carbon emissions especially, one of the concerns that we typically hear a lot from our clients is that, although there are technologies that can help you, there are platforms, right, that helps you manage how you want to, basically how you manage your carbon accounting and tracking and all of that. But, how good are you in actually getting the data, right? Like how are you tracking the data? How reliable is that data? Can you really trust that data? These are questions and concerns that keeps coming up because you want to get to the crux of the problem, right? You want to get a more realistic, accurate, precise reading if you can, and you want to get that quickly as well, so you can learn and do something about it, right? So we see a lot of innovation moving, or rather startups, who are innovating and getting a lot of interest, actually moving into this space. So for example, we've seen startups like GHG Sat, right? They basically focus on using hyperspectral imaging, and they've worked with the likes of Total Energies, even Chevron and Shell, where they've been able to monitor these carbon emissions very closely and provide feedback very quickly to them, right? So we're seeing companies like that definitely playing a bigger role in terms of helping them better understand how they can monitor and track their carbon emissions more effectively. So, I'll also maybe turn it over to some of the other team captains if, you have something to comment. Christine, Harini, Ian, Cecilia.
Well, I think Ari brought up a really good point that even beyond just data collection and data itself, right, there really is a need for, I would say, like standardization in terms of reporting and how sustainability metrics are reported, which sustainability metrics are reported, and there really isn't much regulation around that at the moment. And so I feel like that would be something really to monitor moving forward, because even something like a life cycle assessment and the ones that are being voluntarily disclosed by companies at the moment, right? Those can be a very much a mixed bag in terms of what you get. So that would be also something to keep in mind moving forward.
Right, thank you. So this is really interesting also. On the one hand, you have evolving models and a need for standardization, and then Nardev, you also told us that there's an increased focus on trying to limit the use of models and actually measure directly, like GHD said. Right? I'm going to move on because we covered a lot of ground, so we're also getting a lot of diversity in questions. And there's one question that I have to answer, and I think I'll have to answer it personally because it's more like a challenge, right? There's one question saying that, first of all, that we're in love with the hydrogen economy. We're not. Don't worry, we're not in love with anyone, as far as I know. We do think the hydrogen economy is going to happen. So we're not in love with it. We have some critical notes, but even though we have critical notes, it will happen. And the specific question or remark is that the analysis of the infrastructure required is not complete. That analysis has not been done. So the good news is we have done actually that analysis, and you can find it on our platform. There is a report about the different ways of transporting hydrogen and which way would actually be most cost effective. That's the good news. The bad news is it won't matter. The hydrogen debate will be decided by standard setting, by who's the first mover to really establish a large import and export terminal for hydrogen. That's the company, or that's the consortium, or the group of countries, or whoever it is that makes the first move. And it might be Mitsubishi together with Toyota, by the way. They will just establish the way to go for creating a hydrogen global commodity and a global transportation, much like it happened with LNG. And that's indeed very interesting, because the way things are going right now, it might actually happen next year, or at least within the next 3 years, because there's such a big need right now to alleviate pressure on natural gas and dependence on natural gas. Anyway, sorry guys, I had to take this challenge. I couldn't let us go unchallenged here. Let's go to another question here on recycling. And I know Kristen has a thing or two to say about this. So Kristen, apparently there's some discussion about using mass balance approaches for recycling. And there's debate about it, obviously. Now, the question, of course, is, do we see that debate moving in a particular direction? Will mass balancing become universally accepted, or do you see the debate continuing and not being conclusive? And I think you probably have to unmute. Yeah.
I mean, honestly, that's a really great question. And up to this point, we haven't really seen any movement in the needle on that. So the US still counts pyrolysis as incineration pretty much. The EU is very much still debating over how to define mass balance, whether they're going to go with more of a free attribution model. So what's being the amount of material being recycled will get attributed to materials going into new products, or if it's going to be, polymers only, if that will be considered as recycled content. So we really see this very much still being up in the air. I would say some things that have happened this past year alone are not setting such a good outlook for pyrolysis. So for example, Brightmark didn't move forward with its 400,000 ton planned pyrolysis facility in the United States. And a big part of that was concerns surrounding the environmental impact of that facility. So, you know, I think when it comes to pyrolysis and when it comes to these advanced recycling technologies, there's a lot of interest, right, from a waste mitigation point of view, but there are still concerns and groups, environmental groups, coming out against these types of facilities. So, you know, it's one version of sustainability against the other. And so I think that this is causing trouble when it comes to policymaker stance when it comes to bringing these types and in supporting these types of technologies.
Right. So if I understand you correctly, the debate won't be decisive this year. You know,
yeah.
Good news is our clients will still have to buy our services to keep monitoring this. But it's not looking bright, though, right? That there are some real issues about mass balancing that need to be resolved. Now, in view of time, I also want to get at least one really more technology-centered question in. And we mentioned self-reproduction as something that's really up and coming next year. But it's not really going into the production of bulk chemicals, right? So why wouldn't it? What's keeping self-reproduction from scaling to rival bulk chemical production, for example?
I can chime in a bit here because I think that's a interesting question. So historically, we've seen a lot of the cell-free systems going into specialty chemicals or even like high value ingredients, right? So you have like colors or even food ingredients, rare sugars, for example. So for bulk chemicals, it's just also that how much you can, produce it on scale versus the cost that would be, sold in the downstream market, right? That's where I guess traditionally enzymatic systems are falling behind. However, that being said, there are some interesting startups which are kind of making some, developments here. I would say Solugen, that company based in the U.S., they just raised about $350 million, and the goal here is for them to use the chemoenzymatic step, so it's not completely cell-free. There is a chemical component, but then there's also catalyzed by an enzyme. I think they're targeting hydrogen peroxide as one of their first. Their platform as such could be diversified to multiple other types of ingredients. I think first up, they are going with hydrogen peroxide, and I would say that's one of the bigger developments, at least I've seen. And Kristen can definitely, talk a bit about other types of chemicals. Overall, I guess it's about what type of enzymes you take and how do you engineer them to make sure that you get the yield that you are thinking about. And to that point, if you have cofactors and all of that, I think that's going to really make it a bit more expensive when you think about bulk ingredients. But enzymatic bioconversions for specific steps have proven to be highly selective, stereoselective, or even regioselective. I think that's where you see a lot of companies maybe possibly tying in that enzymatic step with traditional chemical catalysis.
Okay, so stereoselective and highly selective are not things that I necessarily associate with bulk chemicals. So it may be better to start with use that kind of strength of the technology, right? Although your hydrogen peroxide example is quite interesting. So I'm sure the people at Solvay are paying attention because
Absolutely.
it's a direct threat to their big market. With that, I would like to conclude our webinar here today. I'm sure there are many more questions, and we would welcome all of your questions, especially for this webinar, because by posing your questions, you're not only engaging in the discussion, and I would like to thank everyone who participated today in the discussion, but you're also improving our planning for next year. This is the time of the year when we're planning, when we're refocusing our research and making sure we're doing all the right things and speaking to all the right people. Right, our primary research is about talking to people. So we want to make sure we're talking to all the right people next year. And your questions are invaluable as input to it. So don't hesitate, send your questions to questions@luxresearchinc.com. With that, we conclude our webinar for today. The slide presentation and the recording will be sent to all attendees through email still today. And after leaving the webinar, you'll be prompted to complete a survey. And of course, we welcome any feedback as well on the webinar, so we can improve the quality of our webinars steadily. So also take a moment, check out our upcoming webinars. We have one at least every month. So with that, thank you for participating. Thank you for all of your engaging questions, remarks, and for challenging us. And hope to see you soon in one of our next webinars. Goodbye, everyone.